I will introduce our next speaker, Rabbi Leead Staller. Rabbi Leead Staller has been a rabbi in the downtown Manhattan community for the past 5 years, starting with longtime members of the Lower East Side and ultimately ending his time there working with college students. Learning Torah, sharing Shabbat meals, and being in community together with the young college students of the downtown communities reaffirmed Leead's direction and passion for young and new projects like Halachic Left, and he's excited to be a participant in it. And Leead, I will give you the floor.
Hey everybody. I'm honored to be here and it means a lot to share this space with you guys. Tisha B'Av, I'm sure all of us find is a difficult holiday, particularly now, and to various degrees. And I've just found a lot of meaning being in community with everyone. So I'm excited to learn together. I want to give a couple of statements, I guess, a preface. So the first is a broader statement towards the project I see myself as doing in Halacha. If you've learned with me before, if you were at the Halachic Left panel Sunday, the previous Sunday, 2 Sundays ago, a theme that you'll see whenever I teach is that something that's very important to me is to use the traditional tools, texts, and sources of the Beit Midrash, but to show that they, when democratized, when open to more perspectives, when looked at without preconceived notions, lend themselves to a much broader tradition. And that's not to say that, oh, well, we follow blindly whatever the text says, and it just happens to be I can justify that the text doesn't say do genocide or whatever. But it's more to say that this is our tradition and we should have ownership over it. And the same way that people can get up there and say horrible things about Amalek that is like so problematic to us, we should be able to speak that language too and say, no, that's not true. We should be able to make these arguments, to make these cases, to show that our tradition minimally is broad. I would even argue in its context was progressive. So that's just an intro of what the project is today. We're going to analyze fasting on Tisha B'Av, but the goal is to come to a conclusion through the traditional sources and means that will give us something that actually speaks to us in a world where, well, we know the circumstances. So that's one. Two, I guess, speaking more to the circumstances, I just want to say that what inspired me to give this year is that personally this year, Tisha B'Av can feel very navel-gazy in that we've just perpetuated a Churban. Our community has perpetuated a Churban, and we're now all going to sit and lament, oh, they did these terrible things to us 2,000 years ago. And to that extent, Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning, historic mourning, not to minimize the tradition, the obligation, the rabbinic responsibility, etc., but at least emotionally, personally, felt pretty hollow. It felt hard, or it felt indulgent even, to cry about people lost 2,000 years ago, and our community is doing that right now to living people. So what I hope to accomplish over this year is to show that there actually is a much deeper meaning involved in the fasting on Tisha B'Av, not just, oh, we're so sad we were targeted and it sucks to be a victim. And hopefully, you guys will tell me if you agree, a meaning that even in the circumstances we face today resonates and can inspire us to do good in the world. So to that end, let's jump in. And to begin, I want to look at the Talmudic traditional sources that create the obligation, that spell the obligation of Tisha B'Av. So we begin with the Gemara in the first source. So the first source here, if everyone can see my screen share, is the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, which tells us that back in the day, they used to send out messengers before the calendar, before the internet. They'd send out messengers to alert people about the holidays that were upcoming. And it says, Al Shisha Chadashim Ashluchin Yotzin. There were 6 months where the central court would send out messengers to alert everybody. Al Nisan Mipnei Pesach. They would tell everyone when Nisan's coming so they could get ready for Passover. Al Av Mipnei Tanis. On the month of Av, they would warn people Av has started so they can prepare for Tisha B'Av. Al Elul Mipnei Rosh Hashanah. Elul for Rosh Hashanah. Tishrei Mipnei Kanat Moedot. Tishrei because of all the other holidays that are in Tishrei. Al Kislev Mipnei Chanukah. Al Adar Mipnei Purim. Kislev for Chanukah, Adar for Purim. Fine. Kashay Beis Hamikdash Kayam in the days of the temple. Yotzin Afal Iyar Mipnei Pesach Katan. They would also have messengers say, "This is Iyar, and it's your last chance to bring the Korban Pesach if you didn't bring the Paschal offering yet." Sick. So we have this establishment. There's 6 months basically, half the year, have holidays, have events that are significant. But the only fast they mentioned is Tisha B'Av. None of the other fasts, Shavasar B'Tammuz, none of these other fasts we experience throughout the calendar come up. So the Gemara immediately says, "V'lipku nami atamuz v'tevet." What about the other months that have fast days? What about Tammuz and Tevet? The Amar Rav Chana bar Bizna, Amar Rav Shimon Chasida, Mai Dichtiv, and it comes and quotes the pasuk from Zechariah, which serves as the basis, our textual basis for the fast days. Ko Amar Hashem Tzvakot, Tzom Revi'i, Tzom Chamishi, Tzom Shvi'i, Tzom Asiri, Yelavit Yudah L'Sason L'Simcha. The fast days on these following months, on the 4th month, on the 5th month, on the 7th month, on the 10th month, should be what will become celebrations. So they were fast days. In the future, they'll be celebratory. Karu lahom som, v'karu len sasam v'simcha. So the rabbis come and do this really interesting thing where like it seems kind of obvious the intent. The intent of the pasuk is these fast days will one day be celebratory. But the rabbis take it hyper literally and they're like, what do you mean? If it's a fast day, how can we celebrate? Bisman sheyeh shalom yeh l'sasam l'simcha. What it means is when there's world peace or Jewish peace or when there's shalom, that's a very loaded term. We can see what it means. Unsurprisingly, some of the rabbinic authorities say peace just means that there's a temple. That's a whole separate discussion. Not for now. Bisman sheyeh shalom yeh l'sasam l'simcha. They'll be celebratory. Ein shalom, when there isn't peace, it's tzom. They're fast days. Amar Rav Papa Hachi Kamar, this is what it says. Bisman sheyesh shalom, yu l'sasam l'simcha, yishmad tzom. Ein shmad ve'ein shalom, ratu mitanin, ratu ein mitanin. Then for practical halacha, this is a very important line. It establishes in a moment where it's not clear if there's peace, and there isn't an active war or destruction going on, then ultimately the Jewish people are left to their own decision as to whether or not the fast days apply and to the authority of the fast days. So that's an interesting question to think about, not what we're discussing right now. Ihachi Tisha B'Av Nami. So what about Tisha B'Av? Why then does Tisha B'Av get singled out in the Mishnah? In other words, we just asked. Our Mishnah only mentions Tisha B'Av as a fast day on the calendar. What about the other fast days? And it seems like the first answer is that Tisha B'Av is either more authoritative or more definitive. The other fast days, Ratu Mitanin, Lo Ratu In Mitanin. There's this like question of whether or not you're going to fast. But Tisha B'Av, Amar Rav Papa says Shani Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av's different. Because so many terrible things happened on it. The Amar Mar B'Tisha B'Av Charav B'Is Rishon Ub'Shniya B'Nokeda Beitar Nechar Shahir. That the first and second temple were destroyed on Tisha B'Av, that Beitar was conquered, and that the city was utterly destroyed all on Tisha B'Av. So ultimately, our Mishnah and then Gemara point out that it seems that while we've experienced this buildup of fasting that leads to Tisha B'Av, from a halachic perspective, there's two totally separate worlds of fasts. There's all the fasts that we've experienced through the calendar, Shavasar B'Tammuz, all those fasts, and then Tisha B'Av stands alone. It stands alone in terms of obligation, it stands alone in terms of how and when it applies, and I think we all know, experientially, it also stands alone halachically in terms of the restrictions, right? On the Shavasar B'Tammuz, you could shower, you could anoint yourselves, we all love to anoint ourselves, but when it comes to Tisha B'Av, there's all these bodily restrictions beyond eating and drinking that come along. So we have this model where Tisha B'Av is a unique fast day, separate from other fast days. And I think that, like I said, that's both in practice and experientially relevant. But what's so unique about it? So the Gemara tells us a lot of bad stuff happened. There's a quantitative element. It's kind of hard to resonate with, especially because the Gemara also tells us on other holidays a lot of bad stuff happened. On Shavasar B'Tammuz, there's multiple tragedies that occurred. They stopped bringing the Talmud, the Luchos were broken, all these various tragedies. So like, oh, but this has multiple tragedies. So a lot of the commentaries, a lot of the traditional rabbinic authorities try to spell out what exactly does this mean? What's unique about Tisha B'Av? One of the ones I want to highlight here, the Tashbetz, 14th century Spain, ultimately fled to Algeria, a student of the Ran, Rabbi Nissim. The Tashbetz in the 14th century picks up on what we're picking up on here, that Tisha B'Av is being separated out. And he says, Mashalo huskuru b'Gemara, chumrut elu b'shar taniot. The reason the Gemara doesn't tell us to observe the other restrictions of a fast day, the not anointing, not having sex, not wearing shoes, etc., on the other fast days of the calendar, they only mention it on Tisha B'Av. Hu shelafisha davar metaltel b'din bein ratzu bein lav ratzu. Because those other fast days don't apply as definitively. They're dependent upon whether or not the Jewish people want to uphold them. Fine. So this is all from the Ramban. So his first answer is, like we said, a technical halachic thing about the applicability of these holidays. But this is where I want to focus. Inami, an alternative answer. Why is Tisha B'Av so different? Mishum de Tisha B'Av ika milsa achrisi. Tisha B'Av has another element, another character to it, which isn't true of the other fast days. The leika b'shar tzomot afilu ika shmad. Because other fast days didn't have this definitive element of destruction like Tisha B'Av. V'hu mishum chiyuv avelot. And that leads to an obligation of avelot. It leads to an obligation of mourning, going lo yochal basar v'lo yishtayayin. Like we know a mourner and a ninot is limited on the food and drink they can eat. They can't eat meat and they can't drink wine. So too we say because Tisha B'Av wasn't just a build-up. Tisha B'Av was the day of death. Tisha B'Av was when the Beit HaMikdash, Jerusalem, etc. were finally destroyed. It was the conclusionary point. We're in mourning now. In other words, adds the Tashbetz, Tisha B'Av is different in practice. It has multiple other restrictions, such as not wearing shoes, not anointing, not showering, etc., because it's different in character, it's different in nature. On Tisha B'Av is a day of avilut, a day of mourning. The other Taniot, the other fast days, they mark historical tragedy. We're sad about them. Maybe we mourn about specific events. but the halachic character of the day is not imbued with mourning. There aren't mitzvot of mourning. We don't sit on the floor on Shabbat B'Tammuz like we do on Tisha B'Av. And of course, this idea, this isn't unique to the Tashbetz. I just thought it was a very strong illustration that this Gemara's distinction between the holidays that always apply and don't always apply. It is a technical thing about the level of obligation, but it also, beyond that, is noting a different character to Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is Avelut, Tisha B'Av is mourning. And when we look in the Shulchan Aruch, when we look in halachic sources, we see that that's codified. Tisha B'Av has a unique character of mourning. So if you look in source 2 here, towards the very end, we see umitzpalalim benachat, on Tisha B'Av, we daven quietly, derech bechi, sounding as if we're crying, ke'avelim, like mourners. The way we daven on Tisha B'Av is supposed to embody mourning. Similarly, there's a minhag that we have that we don't say Kaddish Tiskabel. We leave out the sentence of Tiskabel, God, please accept our prayers. Because much like a mourner, we're confronted with tragedy. The idea of God answering us, the idea of God being present, that's the farthest thing from our mind right now. We feel rejected, we feel tragic. That's the essence, the environment of Tisha B'Av, is Avelot. Similarly, source 3, the Shulchan Aruch elsewhere also says, B'shat kinot, when you're reciting kinot, asur l'saper davar, you can't say anything, v'letzeit chutz, and you can't go outside, kadei shelo yasik libo min ha'avelot, because we don't want any disruption from the feeling of mourning. The feeling of being in mourning adds a halachic element of how you can talk, how you can conduct yourself in shul, etc. So very, very clearly, we see that Tisha B'Av is codified as special. How is Tisha B'Av special? It's a day of mourning. And what we see even more explicitly is because it's a day of mourning, the Tashbetz says that the mourning is why we fast. Just like a mourner doesn't eat meat or drink wine. There's a parallel here of the restrictions of eating and drinking. So one could conclude that all the other fast days we fast out of historical memory, and on Tisha B'Av we fast out of mourning. It's an expression of mourning to fast. The thing is, though, I think that's actually a pretty difficult perspective to adopt within halacha. I think it's actually a very rare idea that mourning compels fasting in halacha. So the Tashbetz pointed out accurately, of course, that there is a clear halacha that mourners have a limitation on their food and drink. One in a ninot, one who's still tending to the corpse in front of them, lo yochal basar v'lo yishteh yayin, can't eat meat or drink wine. And of course, the Shulchan Aruch codifies on source 4, Misha meita muta lafanav, if the corpse is still in front of you, going down to the Shulchan Aruch, Misha meit lo meit, shu chayiv l'tabel alav, if someone has a deceased person that they're obligated in, they have to mourn over, kodem kfura ocha b'vayit acher, before burial, you can still eat, but you shouldn't eat in front of the corpse. You should eat in another house. Again, remember, this was a time where when someone was deceased, people were much more directly in contact with death. They would watch the body. They would stay with the body. There were even various rituals people would have. But so when the body is in your home, the corpse is in your home, don't eat in the home. It's respect for the dead. So eat in a friend's house. If you don't have another house you could use, then so eat in another house you own if you own multiple houses. If you don't own multiple houses, eat in a friend's house. In bis chavero, if you don't have a friend's house to eat, osalo mechitza v'ochel. Make a partition separating you from the corpse and eat. And then halach continues, ve'ena ochel basar ve'ena shoti yayin. And you can't eat meat and you can't drink wine. Now, what's really interesting though about this restriction is I'd say two things. One, this is applying to aninos. This isn't a general din of avelos of mourning. This is because you have to tend to the corpse that's right in front of you. It's disrespectful maybe to the corpse. It's disrespectful to the physical presence. I'm not sure that's as directly parallel to Tisha B'Av. But maybe we could say we're trying to embody being there while the temple was destroyed. The corpse, the temple's burning in front of us. We're in a nina for the temple. But what I think is really challenging is that what this halacha teaches us definitively is you do eat. A person in mourning eats. The only restriction is they don't eat meat. They don't drink wine. There's like a restriction on the type of eating and drinking, right? And as Dan pointed out in the comments, perfect. We translate this to the Suda Mafsekes that we don't eat meat and drink wine. But what does that have to do with the fasting? The Tashbetz seems to say, oh, just like, we have this limitation, so too we have this limitation. But what do they have to do with each other? One is about not eating meat and wine. One is specifically about limiting the food you actively do eat, because you're going to be eating. The other is about not eating at all. And in fact, we see that there's actually a very complicated and well-built out halachos that indicate that a person who's mourning should, in fact, actively should eat. The Gemara Mo'ikatan, when it deals with avelos, when it deals with the laws of mourning, builds out who's responsible to feed the avel on the first day. And it ends up saying that ideally the community has to feed this person. Clearly they're eating. It's important they eat. That's part of the care that goes on. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Avel Yom Rishon Asur Le'echlo Lechem Mishalo. On the first day of mourning, it's prohibited for a person to eat their own food. Now, mind you, it's not prohibited to eat. Of course they're eating. Food is comfort, food is community, and they need that now. What they need, though, is food from someone else. They need a meal share. They need someone to come and give support to them. As we see, God tells Yecheskel, Lechem Anashim Lo Tochel, that in Yecheskel, God tells Ezekiel to put on a public show of mourning over what's about to occur. And one of those acts of mourning is that he shouldn't eat food. He shouldn't eat bread. There, the Gemara is interpreting this to mean lechem anashim lo tochal, meaning that you shouldn't eat your own bread. Rabbi Rav Yosef mechalfi sudutayu lahadadeh. And we give an example story that Rabbi and Rav Yosef would exchange meals with each other when they both were in mourning. In other words, they make a point to eat other people's food. So we see again, not only is there not a restriction, a fasting that you can't eat anything, there's halachot built out of how do you feed the mourner. And because of those halachot, there are actually Rishonim, poskim, rabbinic authorities who conclude it is forbidden for a mourner to fast. So if you look in the Hagot Ashri, the Hagot Ashri is a commentary, a relatively early mid-medieval commentary on the psak of the Rush, on the halachic decisions of the Rush. And the Hagot Ashri says, "Ein manichin et ha'avel litanop yom rishon ala machlin mashkinato afilu b'tanit shlifnei Rosh Hashanah lo haniach Rosh Bamzal litanop yom hakvura." That when we say we don't allow the person to eat their own food, what we really mean is we don't allow them to fast. And even if the day of Avelos falls out on a minor fast day, we break the minor fast day and make them eat. There's a limitation on someone who's in mourning's ability to fast. I think based on that, it's kind of surprising to see that it's just taken for granted that, well, today's a sad day of mourning and therefore we don't eat or drink. Like, that doesn't seem at all the ethos. If anything, today's a sad day of mourning, we should gather together in a communal meal and comfort each other and talk about the temple, talk about what was lost. Why is it on Tisha B'Av that we don't eat or drink? Where does this come from if it's not just the natural expression of whenever we mourn? So one example, one area I have seen mourning, refusal to eat as an expression of communal mourning, is in the instance of the death of a Talmid Chacham. So the Shulchan Aruch says in source 6, "Hayonogin letanos b'yom misas chachamim." The community had a custom that everyone would fast when a Talmid Chacham dies. And in some senses, I think this is like an interesting model, that in some senses, what we have here is what's the significance of a Talmid Chacham? Why do we give kavod to a Talmid Chacham, to a Torah scholar? Why do we care about a Torah scholar? It's not them as a person, it's them as a conduit to Torah. In other words, I think there is an interesting model that could be explored, that the fasting is an expression of the loss of Torah, that Torah has been destroyed or disgraced, the world is worse off without this Torah, and this disgrace necessitates fasting. And just in terms of our current worlds, I definitely think that there's what to say that feels very relevant. That I think we all see how Torah is marshaled to support genocide, death, destruction, and I think the Torah is crying on this Tisha B'Av, no doubt. So to some extent, I think if we're going to say that maybe there's a communal model of fasting as a velos, based in this idea of, oh, well, when we lose a communal figure, when there's a communal tragedy of a loss of Torah, of integrity, of values, then we all come together and fast. Maybe we can relate a little bit to that. I think that is more meaningful to me, at least personally. But that said, I haven't seen any authorities bring this as a reason to fast on Tisha B'Av. Doesn't seem like halacha codifies it as such. And in fact, I think halacha has a very clear model of what Tisha B'Av is based on. Maybe problematic, we'll discuss that, but when you look in halacha, it seems like the Gemara, like the rabbis very clearly say the fast of Tisha B'Av, the trappings of Tisha B'Av, are very clearly tied, at least in structure, to Yom Kippur. So if you see source 7, Psachim Nindal Amabey says, Ein bein Tisha B'Av li Yom Kippur, ela shezu sveiko asar v'zis sveiko mutter. The only difference between Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av's rules are if you have a suffix, if you're unsure about something on Yom Kippur is a mitzvah d'oraita, it's a Torah commandment, so you have to be strict. Tisha B'Av is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, or maybe Kabbalah, it's some lower rabbinic commandment, so if you have a suffix, if you're unsure, you can be lenient. In other words, says the Gemara Psachim very definitively, Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, at least structurally, at least legally, are identical. These are the same laws. If we're not fasting on Yom Kippur for the death of Talmidei Chachamim, then we're not on Tisha B'Av. Now, interestingly, there is the Asar Harugei Beitar, Asar Harugei Malchus. There's the Talmidei Chachamim who were famously murdered and who we memorialize at Yom Kippur. But that's obviously not what the pasuk, what the verse, what the biblical origin of Yom Kippur is about, which we'll get to. But nonetheless, we see very clearly in the Talmud, the mourning on Tisha B'Av is not about disgrace of the Torah. It's not about anything other than we have a commandment that's modeled on Yom Kippur. And in many ways, this is really challenging, right? Because when we think about Yom Kippur, why do we fast on Yom Kippur? God said to, because we're atoning, because we're so busy, we're supposed to be like angels. There's all these reasons, which maybe we'll get to. We definitely will get to. But what does that have to do with Tisha B'Av? Tisha B'Av has nothing to do with Yom Kippur. If anything, Yom Kippur celebrates the day that God gave us forgiveness, gave us a second set of tablets, where God said, it's okay, you have another chance. Tisha B'Av memorializes the day where God said, no more chances. You screwed up, it's done. We're taking it all away. How are we paralleling these two? Right? They seem so contradictory. And of course, I'm not the first person to raise this point. Actually, if you look in the source here, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, one of my teachers back in the day, back when I felt more comfortable learning in the West Bank, I'll admit that I do not now, and I regret that. But Rav Moshe Lichtenstein has a really interesting article, What Hath Brisker Wrought, where he's dissecting the methodology used in the Brisker and the yeshiva world of analyzing Talmud. And he highlights this parallel, the fact that the Talmud makes a parallel between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, as one of those traps, one of those red herrings, where you might say, oh, therefore Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur have a lot in common. But you have to be better than that and know enough Torah to realize, no, they have nothing to do with each other. The themes are so contradictory that the Gemara is merely making a structural parallel. These both are fast days. There's nothing else to compare, no themes to compare. So if you look inside, Rav Moshe says, the element of mourning regarding Tisha B'Av is already explicit in the Gemara, and therefore must be factored into the equation. Rav Velvel, the Brisker Rav, who he's analyzing in this larger piece, zeroing in on the halachic expression, points out that it is prohibited to dip a finger in water on Tisha B'Av, just as it is on Yom Kippur. So the restrictions, the 5 restrictions of bathing, are equally restricted on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, and therefore concludes that Tisha B'Av is unlike any other fast day in which only bathing of the entire body is prohibited. Rather, it is like Yom Kippur in that even a single finger is prohibited. True to his method, he does not inquire why Tisha B'Av should be analogous to Yom Kippur, but simply identifies a shared symptom as proof of a common denominator and rests his case. So Rav Moshe sets up that the traditional yeshiva approach, the Brisker approach, is to say we see clearly in the Gemara, Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av are compared. The laws, the practical laws are compared. So what we should do is transport the structures of Yom Kippur, which we have Torah basis for, biblical basis for, a much broader base to understand and to figure out, and just transpose them onto Tisha B'Av. Say the rabbis just copied that thing. And therefore we'll have a really good structure, we'll understand how Tisha B'Av works. But says Rav Moshe, while that might be appealing structurally, while you might see that Chazal point to similarities in the way these mitzvot are observed, these two mitzvot have nothing to do with each other. They have nothing to do with the same themes. The reason we fast seems so different. So says Rav Moshe, second paragraph here, simply put, if attention is paid only to factual information, then the claim can be made that Tisha B'Av is similar to Yom Kippur and different from the communal fast day. In other words, what the Brisker Rav is proposing is Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur are one group, and the other fasts, which are about the temple and destruction of Jerusalem, are distinct and are part of a separate group. Seems very difficult. So, however, once we attempt to gauge the reasonableness of this claim, based on the perceived nature and character of Tisha B'Av, then we must reassess the issue and refuse to separate Tisha B'Av from the category of the communal fast day. For while the upshot of Rav Velvel's interpretation is that there's a separate concept of bodily abstention, dependent on rest or fasting, which follows Tisha B'Av to be grouped with Yom Kippur, this contention seems eminently unreasonable, although formally possible. In other words, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, in his article arguing that Torah should make sense and not just be about structural parallels and empty laws, says, what's his example of a senseless halacha, of a thing that doesn't make any sense if you think about it? The fact that people parallel Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. The content of them are just totally different. They have nothing to do with each other. So, first of all, I think it's pretty challenging that this is based in a Gemara. It's not like Rav Velvel, the Brisker Rav, made up this parallel. I guess Rav Moshe would say the problem is taking that Gemara too far. All the Gemara is teaching us is that the laws are parallel in practice. The reasons and themes are totally distinct, is what you'd have to say. And that leads us with very little to model our fasting on Tisha B'Av on. If anything, maybe that's why mourning took the spot. Because if Tisha B'Av equals Yom Kippur, nothing about Yom Kippur really applies today. We have this void, we have this vacuum. So what's the only thing else we know about today? Well, if it's not like the other fast days, well, we know that today's a mourning day. So it must be all the things we do are out of mourning. And I think that does kind of make sense. We understand how if there's a desire to separate Tisha B'Av from the other fast days, then everything becomes about the unique nature of Tisha B'Av. But I think it's just hard to say that when the Gemara makes a strong parallel to Yom Kippur, it doesn't mean anything about the nature or content or themes of Yom Kippur. All it's doing is making a very slight parallel between they're both fast days. Especially the language here. Ein bein Tisha B'Av Yom Kippur. There's no difference. They are exactly the same in observance. And we're supposed to get from that, oh, it's just teaching us that you have restrictions on that day. So I think that's kind of surprising. I also think it's surprising how deep this strain runs throughout the tradition. That Tisha B'Av, in some sense, in some way, is modeled on Yom Kippur. So, for example, Rambam, when he's codifying the laws of Tisha B'Av, makes a point to include in the codification, part and parcel of the codification of how the law is observed, is this reality that it's based on Yom Kippur. It says Rambam here in source 8 in the Yad Chazaka and its halachic codification, Din ta'anito, the din of the fast, kedin tanis tzom kippur, is like the din, is like the halacha of the fast on Yom Kippur. Rotzel lamar, meaning she'asr berchitza besicha b'nila tesandal b'tash mishamita, that you can't do any of the five restrictions, umosifin michol kodesh, and you do tosefah, you add onto it. This is fascinating. One could have claimed all Rambam is saying is that we should learn the rules of fasting on Rosh Tisha B'Av from the rules of fasting on Yom Kippur. But Rambam actually goes further. Rambam says the parallel between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur is so substantive, is so important, that we don't just learn restrictions, we learn mitzvot aseh, we learn active responsibilities. Just like there's a responsibility to start fasting earlier at night to extend the day of Yom Kippur, there's a responsibility, which we all did last night, to extend the fast of Tisha B'Av and accept it early, to make a tosefet Tisha B'Av, in addition to Tisha B'Av. In other words, says Rambam clearly, there's something actively, thematically parallel going on here. Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av have something in common, and not only do we learn the structure of the limitations of the restrictions, but we learn about the nature of the day. The Kedushas Yom Kippur extends past 25 hours, so too the Avelos of Tisha B'Av must extend past 25 hours. A fascinating claim, especially given what Rav Moshe seems to say, that there's no thematic connection between the two of these. So far, so good? Good. So, one answer I found that maybe it speaks to some of you guys, you'll let me know at the end, doesn't really speak to me, is that no, of course there's a thematic parallel between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur are both God's responses to the Jews' sin in the Midbar, in the desert. And what this answer does is it takes hyper-literally the Midrash, this Agadic rabbinic statement found in source 9, that B'Tisha B'Av nigzar avotenu shelo yikansu la'aretz. That Tisha B'Av was when the Jewish people sinned with the spies and were informed that they weren't going to be allowed to enter Israel. So some people like to claim that what's going on here, the parallel, is a historical parallel. It's not a parallel on the content of the day. It doesn't mean the themes of the day are the same. It doesn't mean the observances of the day are the same. It means the historicity of it is the same. Just like Yom Kippur we have to do because our ancestors in the desert screwed up and worshipped the golden calf, so too Tisha B'Av we have to do because our ancestors in the desert screwed up and did the Chet HaMeraglim. So great question Yavi is raising here, but if that's the case, there's many things that are memorialize desert tragedies, such as Shvirat HaLuchot, the breaking of the Luchot on Shavasar B'Tammuz, right? If really all we're doing here is saying, well, this is a historical parallel, these things all happened in the desert, beyond not necessarily being the most meaningful answer, it doesn't really answer all the cases. What about the other fast days? So I think we're left with, before we get to what I want to develop as our answer, as follows. Tisha B'Av is singled out clearly in the Gemara, in Halacha, and in observance, as different from the other fast days that commemorate the invasion and destruction and the siege of Jerusalem. Why is it different? One halachic theme we see brought up frequently is that it's a day of mourning. But as we've at least complicated, if not refuted, it's not so clear mourning is related to fasting at all. If anything, maybe mourning is related to eating. So how does this Tisha B'Av as a day of mourning necessitate fasting? So we proposed that we should look at the source of the fast of Tisha B'Av, and found that it's actually rooted, at least structurally, at least halachically, legally, in the fast of Yom Kippur. And we said that's kind of difficult. In fact, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein and other authorities have said, like, oh, this is so hard that it must not be thematically parallel. It's just a very shallow comparison. But maybe there's some more substantive parallel there, some more substantive comparison between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. The first thing we proposed is maybe the parallel there is a historical parallel. They both commemorate desert ideas, desert sins. And we said, no, that doesn't really make sense, because what about breaking the Luchot? What about other things? And beyond that, why should something taking place in the desert be oh so significant? Why should that be the most important thing? Okay. So I want to propose that really there is a very substantive parallel between Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. And not just substantive in a couple of themes. I want to claim that what the rabbis did was they looked at Yom Kippur as a model of relationship between Adam Lamakom, of how man can violate God's relationship and trust so much that God withdraws, and use that as a model for Tisha B'Av as a day of reflection b'nadam l'chavero, as a day where we recognize that man can violate man's trust so much that God withdraws. In other words, the rabbi saw a thematic parallel between Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, but just applied it slightly differently. Yom Kippur is the day where we push God away, whereas Tisha B'Av is the day where God leaves us because of how we treat each other. And I think that then gets reflected thematically in the day, in the observance, in the fasting. So to try and understand that, let's understand why we fast on Yom Kippur. So I threw out all these random ideas that I'm sure many of us have heard growing up. You're like an angel, and angels don't eat. You're supposed to be so focused on davening and in shul all day, you can't take a break for a meal. All these various things. But biblically, the verse roots the need to fast on Yom Kippur in a very unusual term. So if you look in verse 10, Pasuk says, "Kichol nefesh asher lo tu'uneh be'etzem hayom hazeh v'nechrata me'ameha." Any person who does not do inoi, lo tu'uneh. Here, Sefaria translate that as self-denial. We'll get back to that. But this is the source for fasting. So anyone who doesn't do the restrictions of Yom Kippur, v'nichrata me'ameha, gets karet, is cut off from the community. And anyone who does labor on Yom Kippur, I'll make them lost from the nation. Don't do labor. This is eternal law. Shabbat Shabbatonu lechem, it's a day of rest for you. Again, that key term, inoi, and you should either deny or afflict or something we'll get back to at your soul. But Tisha l'chodesh, interestingly, on the 9th of the month is when it applies. Interesting parallel. Tisha B'Av, Yom Kippur, while taking place on the 10th of the month because of the extension, because of Tosefis. Yom Kippur actually starts on the 9th of the month as well. Just an interesting parallel. But Tisha l'chodesh, on the 9th of the month, May Erev ad Erev, from one eve to the next for 25 hours, Tishbatu Shabbatchem. You should have this great rest. So we see, beyond this funny, interesting parallel of the 9th day of the month, that the reason we fast on Yom Kippur is because the Torah commands us to do inoi, ta'aneh enafshotechem, self-denial, affliction. It's actually not really clear here what inoi means. And in fact, it's so not clear what inoi means. Just to draw this out, it's not clear what inoi means because the Bible could have just said don't eat and don't drink, right? It could have said don't eat, don't drink, don't bathe, don't have sex, don't wear shoes. The reason the Bible uses the word inoi is that it feels that there's one word that captures all of these ideas that develop out of this idea, right? Instead of listing the specific restrictions or telling us what the day should look like, the Torah commands a vibe, commands a sense of what we should be doing. We should be doing inoi, and everything naturally flows from that. But what's inoi? And it's not just me asking this. The rabbis realized this is a weird term to try and capture practical restrictions. If I can't eat, say don't eat. If I can't drink, say don't drink. What does inoi mean? So the rabbis implicitly question this in the Midrash when they draw a parallel to elsewhere in the Torah to try and understand what there's a verb that compels us to fast on Yom Kippur. This inoi, what does it mean? It says the Sifra in source 11, Mishum Rabbi Yishmael said, Amru ne'amar kan ta'anu nafshotechem. By Yom Kippur it says you should do inoi, denial or affliction to your soul. V'nemar lahalan, and later in the Torah, by the man it says, V'ya'ancha v'yarivecha. God made you hungry, and v'ya'ancha, he did inoi to you. He denied you, he tortured you, something. Ma inoi ha'amar lahalan re'evon, just like by man, inoi is applied to mean hunger, af inoi ha'amar kan re'evon. So too, the inoi that is here means hunger. And from there we get to this idea that it's self-denial. So of course it's based in source 12, the pasuk of the man, Moshe in Dvarim, when he's recounting his history of the desert, says God did inoi to you, he made you hungry. You see the Sfari says hardship of hunger, and he gave you man. So says the Sifra, from the fact that inoi is used for what God did in the case of man, and the Jewish people were hungry when they complained for man, inoi must mean making yourself hungry. It's a very interesting parallel. But if what the rabbis were really doing here was defining the restrictions, we're listing out the things that we couldn't do, this is a terrible parallel. We don't learn anything about drinking. We don't learn about anointing. We don't learn about bathing. We don't learn about sex. What do we learn from this? All we learn is you can't do the action of eating. That doesn't even capture a halachic fast day. Halachic fast days are eating and drinking. How is this where the rabbis learn, oh, well, these are the restrictions? Rather, I think what the rabbis are doing is not making a practical point of, oh, just like that's a limitation on food, so too we have a limitation on food. But they're making a thematic point that the themes of what the Jewish people experienced in the desert while they ate man, that thematic point is the exact same thing that we're trying to do here on Yom Kippur. And what do I mean by that? So if you look in source 13, or between 12 and 13, the ones I added myself aren't numbered, Rav David Zvi Hoffman, major, important late 19th century German Orthodox back then. I don't know if he would be now, but important early, someone who was both in the academic world and in the Beis Medrash world, Rosh Hashiva. Rav Leead comes in, he has a lengthy and beautiful commentary in the Torah. And here on his commentary in Dvarim, he says, what's it mean, v'ya'ancha? How do God oppress us, deny us, make us struggle with man? Ha'inoi v'harav, both the oppression and the hunger, hitzbatu bekach, are expressed, ba'ochlamet haman, lo hayu rishayim l'tzpor lehem seda liyom machar, that you weren't allowed to collect food for the next day. And you had to constantly rely on God to give you food. And then he has another thing, and also they got sick of the food eventually, so that must have sucked. But the first point I want to highlight, which I think is so interesting and really opens all of this up, is what's the challenge of man? Why is man so bad? It's so bad that God gives you magic food from the sky? That's oppressive? That's Inoi? The challenge of man is that you cannot be fully self-reliant. You cannot prepare food for tomorrow. You can't care for your family. You have to rely on God to provide for you. That's the challenge of man. The Inoi of man is that you are not capable of caring for yourself. You're not capable of putting your clothing on, of showering, of anointing. You are not a functional human. You don't have the resources and privilege and means to take care of yourself right now, just like the Jews in the desert. True, the Jews in the desert had God do it for them. Midrash says God made sure their shoes didn't wear out, there was water to bathe in, there was food from the sky, but it was still Enoi because of that utter dependency they had on others. And I think the reason this is so moving, so key to Yom Kippur, is because what we're trying to accomplish on Yom Kippur is a recognition of our dependence on God. We ask for atonement because we recognize we are fully dependent on God. We couldn't do anything. We don't mean anything without God and the religious community that gives us our meaning. But I think the recognition there is that through understanding the dependency of humanity, through understanding what it is to be an ani, to be Inoi in the sense of ani, of poverty, to be the marginalized and impoverished who don't have the privilege of self-confidence, to say, it's okay, I'll take care of it tomorrow, we can understand that we are no different in the eyes of God. We are just as poor off as the impoverished, and we too, in the eyes of God, are fully dependent. Now that said, of course, this play acting as a poor person can easily lead into offensive or just farcical areas. And that's why on Yom Kippur we read the Haftorah from Yeshayahu, where Yeshayahu comes and says, why are you acting like poor people to get close to God when you're not feeding the poor people in the streets? And to me, that always seemed like such a weird critique. Like, what, we're not supposed to fast if there are poor people in our community? They're just different mitzvot. But the whole point is, you're not just fasting, you're embodying the neediness of the impoverished. And if there are impoverished people in your community that you don't take care of, clearly you don't understand what it's like to be dependent on others. It's meaningless to fast then. You are not embodying, you are not understanding that the point of this fast is to be an ani, to be one who cannot care for themselves and is dependent on God for their needs. So says Yeshayahu in source 13, is this the fast day that I wanted? Yom anot adam nafsho, that you're just afflicting yourself? Does God really want you to wear sack and ashes and afflict yourself? In my opinion, a clear rejection of the classical interpretation of Yom Kippur. God doesn't care about Inoi affliction at all. This is the fast God wants. Patech chartsubot resha. Unlock the fetters of wickedness. Heter agudot mota. Untie the cords of the yoke. Break off the oppression. Halo faros la'ra'ev lachmecha. Unfortunately, particularly meaningful now given what's going on in Gaza. It is to share your bread with the hungry. That's the fast day God wants. God doesn't want you denying and hurting yourself. God wants you sharing the bread with the hungry. Inoi, on Yom Kippur, just as much as it's etymologically rooted to affliction, to humility, to being lesser, is also related to ani, to poor, to being impoverished and marginalized. Ta'anu nafshotechem doesn't mean hurt yourself, God forbid. It means make yourself like a poor person, dependent on God, dependent on others, and understand what that means. Understand what it means to be fully dependent on God, and through that you'll achieve atonement, you'll achieve prayer, you'll achieve closeness to God that's meaningful. So to review, I think it's clear that the mitzvah of Yom Kippur, of fasting on Yom Kippur, of doing inoi, of afflicting maybe, is much better understood as ani, of impoverishing yourself, so that you can truly embody and understand the dependency man has on God and on others. To know that you are not your own God, your own creator. You cannot do whatever you want. You have to ask your friends for forgiveness. You have to ask God for forgiveness. You have to think, how am I situated relative to my community? How am I situated relative to God? That's the Inoi of Yom Kippur. Now, I think if we take that idea of the Inoi of Yom Kippur and think about how it applies to Tisha B'Av, It's so obvious, it's so applicable, it's so meaningful in a slightly different way. Because we know what's Chazal's theme and focus on Tisha B'Av. Why was the Beis Hamikdash destroyed? Because of a lack of social cohesion. Because of sinat chinam. We see the Gemara in Yuma says, they did all the ritual stuff in the second temple. Why was it destroyed? Because there was hatred of fellow man. Because there were social ills. If you read Eicha, you read about the false prophets. You read about the Kohanim, the priests who are incapable of doing anything for the Almana and Yatom, for those in need. You learn about the societal structural failure to care for those who are marginalized. So why do we fast on Tisha B'Av? The same structure as Yom Kippur. We're not hurting ourselves or afflicting ourselves. We're embodying what it means to be impoverished, to be dependent on each other, to be dependent on God. But here we're not doing it so we can go and pray all day and sit in shul all day and pray to God and ask God to accept us. Here we're doing it as a motivation to correct the ills that led to our korban, to correct the mistakes that led to our destruction. It was the lack of social cohesion. It was the lack of anti-corruption. It was the lack of values and institutions and the community that the Jewish people built that led to the korban. It was the fact that people didn't think about the poor person in the street that led God to take the temple away from us. And what we do on Tisha B'Av, similar in fact to what we do on Yom Kippur as we seek God's presence, is we realize the first step to achieving that is turning towards our fellow man, is understanding what it's like to be marginalized, what it's like to be poor, what it's like to be dependent and not privileged in society, and using that as a motivator to create a better society. Yom Kippur, we use that as a motivator to double down on our ritual observance, as a motivator to realize we need God. On Tisha B'Av, we do that to double down on the fact to recognize we need each other. And that's why there's all these restrictions during the worst of Yom Kippur about talking to your fellow man, about having shalom bein chavero, about having social moments of connection, because we're supposed to feel what it's like to not have a community. The Beis Hamikdash was taken away, destruction and genocide and awful murder comes from a lack of communal cohesion around important values, from a community built on corruption, from a community built on selfishness. And on Tisha B'Av, we embody that. We correct for that. We understand what it's like to be the ani, what it's like to be the impoverished, because we recognize it's not through prayer, fasting, sacrifice that God's going to come and fix things, that we'll get a new temple, that we'll get a Messiah. The corrections that's needed in our world are for us to repair these social ills that can lead to such massive destruction, death, and loss. So Tisha B'Av, much like Yom Kippur, we re-embody the sense of ani, of impoverishment, of marginalization, to better understand how interconnected we all are, how interdependent we all are, and through that, hopefully, to build a better community together. Now, so just to review, before I go into the conclusion report, we said that it seems that the previous models of how Tisha B'Av, the fasting of Tisha B'Av has been modeled don't seem fully satisfactory. It can't just be about mourning, because mourning doesn't usually mean communal fasting. And we said, clearly, structurally, it's related to Yom Kippur. We proposed the new idea of Yom Kippur, that the fasting on Yom Kippur is actually about embodying the steps of the marginalized and impoverished in society to recognize we're dependent on God. And we said what the rabbis are doing on Tisha B'Av is copying that structure, but instead of recognizing how dependent we are on God, we're supposed to recognize how interdependent we all are, to build a better community, a better society, a less corrupt society. Tisha B'Av is the Bein Adam L'Chavero cognate of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is easy. Yom Kippur is a happy day, because when it comes to God, God can guarantee us that God will forgive us. When it comes to Bein Adam L'Chavero, as we all see, there's a lot more work. It's a sad day. It's not so obvious if there's going to be light at the end of the tunnel. So, given that, just to bring it all back home explicitly to at least my experience, maybe I'll speak to some of you. I think the idea of Tisha B'Av as mourning for a temple that we lost, as being sad that thousands or millions of Jews died 2,000 years ago, is indulgent in the current world. We're perpetuating worse genocides and tragedies in Israel right now, in Palestine right now, in Gaza, and to say that, oh, well, when it happens to us, the world should stop and mourn, that doesn't resonate with me. But what does resonate to me now, maybe more than ever, is the sense that it's our brethren, it's our community that's doing this. It's our lack of social cohesion. It's our lack of accountability to each other. It's a lack of understanding that all people are dependent on each other, that no one is lesser and no one is more than, that leads to the destruction, leads to the genocide that we've all borne witness to. So in many ways, while I know that maybe many of us are feeling like, oh, Tisha B'Av is such an awkward holiday, given the current reality, given our worldview, I think Tisha B'Av is maybe like the most leftist of holidays, the most anti-Zionist, the most appropriate of holidays. Because Tisha B'Av is the day where we learn we lose Israel if we don't have the right values. We lose Israel if we're doing all the ritual stuff right, but it's built on corruption. And to me, sadly, that feels very relevant today. So now we have some time if I want to open the floor, if anybody has any questions or wants to speak to if that's relevant to you too. Thank you guys so much for learning with me, and I hope the rest of the fast is easy and meaningful for everybody. Feel free if you want to just unmute yourself and speak if you have something to say. But if not, we can also just end early.
You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Ezra said in the chat, in the Inoi framing, what's the purpose of non-Tisha B'Av Yom Kippur fasting? And is whatever that reason is less important. Okay, good. So Ezra is raising, this wasn't the focus of the shiur, but since we have a little time, I'll just point out, it seems clear to me, and this is very clear, I think, based in the Rambam, that fasting is actually a moment of communal prayer. The point of fasting is the community is getting together to address a crisis. There's no crisis we're addressing right now. I mean, there's a social crisis, I would say, but there's no immediate impending crisis that we're addressing right now or embodying. I think that there's two models of fast. There's the fasts of all the other days, which are like volitional fasts. The community gets together and prays really hard. And then there's Yom Kippur and the rabbinic translation of Yom Kippur Tisha B'Av, which are about embodying the impoverished, embodying the marginalized, and not just about fasting as a part of prayer and ritual observance, which back then was a very common part of the world. But great question, Ezra. Shiur, I see. Please just feel free to jump in.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, given just like the non-theoretical bent of your message, if you might like reflect a little more on the Rav Moshe reading.
Sure.
I don't know what you think about that in the context of like religious Zionism in this moment. And almost I can't help but think more about like the way that analysis of this source, how it might feed into like how that sort of approach to analysis of sources might feed into or be impacted by the kind of ecosystem of religious Zionism. I'm
Beautiful.
wondering if you had any thoughts about that or might just like think in real time out loud about that.
Shiur is
Um,
not a plant because I'm not smart enough to plant a question like this, but that is the perfect question. For those who were at the Halachic Left panel a couple weeks ago, I opened when I presented by speaking about similarly a Gush rabbi who I learned Torah from, who confronted an issue and said, I don't really have an answer, and there is no good answer to this question. And I actually think that this is something that I've experienced commonly, that even beyond what I think is more pressing, the human rights values, the needs people have, Torah is impoverished for being in the world of religious Zionism. The way they view the world is limited. The values that they're viewing the world through are so limited that they're not able to explain Torah. And I think that this is a beautiful example of how it's so easy to say the Torah is regressive when you come to it with a regressive view and you're like, oh, well, the things that push against that just don't make sense. And there's a bunch of things that just don't make sense in the Torah, and that's really hard. But like, I think you're totally right. That this is like an example of something that I feel very passionate about. The reason everyone in this Zoom needs to be learning Torah, writing Torah, producing Torah, is because everyone in the Zoom has experience and perspectives that the traditional Torah world, it's not that they don't have as much, they are counter and contrary to. They don't believe in. And the Torah is poorer for that. So I completely agree that this is a great example of how, through not being limited to the world perspective, let's say, of religious Zionism, you're opening up to yourself so many more worldviews of Torah, and hopefully through that also changing your worldview to be a more inclusive humanist one. I would hope. Did that address what you were getting at?
yeah, can I just add one thing like to sort of build on what you presented us with?
Please, yeah.
I think that what you're saying is like you're talking back to the Rav Moshe reading and saying actually like they have a parallel structure and they are about different things. That's all true. And then like the third part is, but the point is those two things that are different are like the reason they have parallel structures is because they're part of the same thing. They're necessary. It's like if you're going to see one as being Adam Lamakom and the other as being Adam Lachavero, it's almost stopping too short to say that they're not about the same thing. Like that's sort of very, very narrow sighted. The point is that you're saying they have parallel structures. They speak to two different themes, and those themes are lost without one another. Like that's kind of the tie at the end, right?
Exactly. Beautiful. Yeah. I would say that Rav Moshe concludes this article with question begging because he says, oh, well, they're just parallel in structure. But what I'm trying to address is why would they be parallel in structure? And the answer is because what they're trying to accomplish is parallel, even if the reason why they have to accomplish that is different. Beautiful. Thank you guys so much for learning with me. Oh, someone texted a question in the group. I could also read the provisioning among another reason doesn't know as poverty and dependency, but as a return to Edenic state. Would that be very off base? Excellent, Abel. I actually think that so much of the Torah and the focus on Shemitah and Yovel and the agricultural laws are actually a recall to Eden, not in the sense of idyllic state, but in the sense that Eden is actually a huge challenge to humanity today to be fully dependent on God. And I agree. I think just like Shemitah is a challenge that we're dependent on God for that year because we can't go and, plant our own fruit, create our own produce, and therefore we're fully dependent on God. I think Shemitah is a re-embodying of the desert and the manna. I think so much of Jewish ritual is a re-embodying of this sense of dependency. And I think nowadays, maybe you can say it's fallen, maybe it's just the reality of like a non-Edenic world, but I think Eden seems to us as a challenge. There's obviously benefit to not being in a capitalist hellhole where you have to work or you die. But the idea of not being in control of your own food, not being in control of your own life, not being able to provide for your own family, I think to the modern world, the curse of having to sweat for your bread isn't just that you sweat for your bread, it's that we want to. We want to be the ones who are in control of our life.
Someone has a raised hand. Alexander.
Hi. So I'm wondering if you can comment on the way that we are meant to relate to the mourning of the actual destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and what the symbolism of the Beis Hamikdash is in the context of the framework that you're laying out.
Excellent. So I would say that undeniably, there's still the mourning of the Beis Hamikdash. To me, the Beis Hamikdash is the Gviyah, is the corpse for this community. While the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, that's the final blow. That's the clear sign that we're too far gone for God to have a presence with us. But it's not about the ability to do, the Tamid or like we had such a close Shekhinah. Like all of those things are byproducts of God deeming our community one that is not worthy of the Shekhinah, not worthy of a Beis Hamikdash. The reason for that is this social corruption. So I definitely do think Avelos and the Beis Hamikdash is a huge element, of course, to Tisha B'Av. I don't want to downplay that. I more want to push against the sense that the Beis Hamikdash is important because it's a sign of sovereignty and ability to go to our temple and ability to offer our prayers in the bed. Like it's not about the ideal ritual world. If anything, it's the flip. We lose the ideal ritual because of the corruption of the social.
Well, what about the idea of a Beis Hamikdash as a universal place of humanism and
Yeah, but beautiful. I mean, it sounds like you're asking me a leading question. You should just spell it out. I think there's an active parallel you can make here that much like the Sefer Chinuch talks about the point of a mikdash is that everyone gathers there together, or like the Nevi'im talk about how the mikdash, well, it's machlokas the Nevi'im, but some of the Nevi'im talk about how the mikdash is where all the world's nations will gather together. We see that even the ritual of the mikdash is a ritual that brings people together and creates the sense of a broader community worshiping God. So of course, if we don't have an interconnected community of values, what's the point of the mikdash? What are you going to do with it? Beautiful. I think we should probably end here so that there's a little. I mean, Caroline, you let me know if I'm right,
We
but
could go for maybe a couple more minutes.
okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to speak up? Can you say? I'm reading the chat now. Can you say more about
Someone has a raised hand. There also might be some ones in the chat. I don't know which
Yeah,
one.
I'm going to read one from the chat, and then whoever raised their hand, just speak up after I answer that one. So, can you say more about Tisha B'Av as an anti-Zionist commemoration? In the past, various Zionist orgs use this day as a way to fundraise for Israel and prove why Zionism is still relevant. So, I think that just like Dr. Harris pointed out, it's exactly that flip of viewing the Beis Hamikdash as a central point of sovereignty and power and ritual, and instead viewing it as a sign of communal cohesion. That the Zionist community has very much stuck to this day, similar to the Temple Institute and all these trappings of the temple, as a sign of an idyllic period before we had to share the land with Muslims or before we had to have, real world considerations. This is a sign that we were in full control. We could do whatever we want. We could sacrifice animals. But I don't think that has to be the symbol, and I don't think that was intended to be the symbol. I think, if anything, that's like a very empty, hollowing out of what the Beis Hamikdash, what the temple, what the commemoration is about. That the commemoration really is that you lose the temple when you don't have social cohesion. And to me, like that is not even cohesion, because cohesion can be for bad things. You lose the temple when you have social corruption. And to me, like that is the motivation for those in our community who speak out against Zionism. That we're seeing our friends, our family, we're seeing other people's friends and family. And of course, like I said, we're seeing the Torah and Judaism being corrupted because of this value. We're seeing it taken away from us more and more. We're seeing it get harder and harder to connect to. And to me, I think that that's like the most anti-Zionist of holidays, to commemorate that and to recognize we have to do something to stop it. And someone had a hand raised. If you could just speak up now.
I raised my hand, but I lowered it because I just didn't want to get off track. But I had basically wondered if did you intentionally mean to compare this fast to other fast as like a teaching structure? The reason I asked is because I don't know, but we all presented keynote a few people, and I presented the one that compares Pesach to Tisha B'Av and I mentioned that I thought it was a really interesting teaching framework. So I was wondering if you had intentionally did that, and if you, because there are some rabbis who did not think that that was a good practice and felt like it's a very simplistic practice, and they disagreed with it for other reasons. So I'd just be curious of like what did you think about that?
I'm not fully sure I get the question. Maybe we should continue afterwards in email, but I'll just say that I definitely, to me, like one of the motivating questions definitely was how do we situate this fast in relation to other fast days? And like I definitely do agree with the sense that like I've seen rabbis struggle with that, and some have really strong feelings about what's appropriate or not, or like how do we compare these? Like personally, I'm not totally sure I followed the question, so please follow up with me afterwards. But I just want to say that like definitely pedagogically, I think that like the question we should always be starting with is, does this thing make sense with our lived experience? So our lived experience is there are fast days. That's a group. Like they're the fast days to us. So then the next question is, why are there differences between them? So to me, like I think you have to start with experience of like these things are naturally grouped together, and then you can start dissecting like what do you learn from that? But please feel free to follow up with me for more specific. All right. Thank you everybody so much for learning together. This was great.